Hi, Mike Cannell here with Orcas Island Leather Goods, and today we'll be assembling our chessboard. This project is a lot of stitching, upwards of 20 hours, but is definitely worth it. It is all straight saddle stitching, and the most important thing is to plan your stitching paths so you start and end where you want to. If you haven't watched our How to Hand Stitch video, I suggest reviewing that before beginning. The first thing we'll do is place the heavier backer piece of leather face down, and then lay the black leather face up on top of it, making sure all the stitching holes align properly. If the inner stitching holes do not line up, simply rotate the black leather 90 degrees. The chestnut leather square inserts will be stitched into the openings of the black leather as you see here. Get your needles and thread, as well as your thread cutting and melting tools, and let's get started. Start by stitching all the way around the outer stitch line. You won't be able to do it all in one go, so start with a length of thread that feels comfortable for you, maybe 6 to 7 feet. When you run out of thread, backstitch and melt your ends on the backside per usual, then rethread your needles and continue stitching from that last used hole so it looks like one continuous stitch line. For the interior of the board, you will want to plan your starting and ending stitching holes ahead of time. For the corners, I found it easiest to begin in the corner even though it is in the middle of a stitch line. Using about 4 to 5 feet of thread, stitch forward to the Y, and then with only one needle stitch out and back for those two holes. Here I use a regular 2-needle saddle stitch to get out to the Y, and then a single needle to go out and back for these two holes. It will look like you are skipping a stitch on your way out, but that will get filled in on your way back. Do not connect from this last hole into the chestnut square. The design intends for this stitch line to end here. And now we're back where we started. Now proceed on the other path of the Y and continue directly into the chestnut square, resuming a typical 2-needle saddle stitch. So here I'm stitching along the second branch of the Y toward the first inset, where we will continue stitching onto the chestnut square. Anytime my thread gets twisted, I take the time to straighten it out, as that isn't something you can fix later. Stitch around the inset piece and back to where you started. Then, starting in the same original hole in the corner, stitch in the other direction and add the next chestnut square. The chestnut squares are designed to fit perfectly flush inside the black leather. Now that we've added the chestnut inset, we'll use our 2-needle saddle stitching to stitch up and around to the crossover to the next chestnut square. If your square has an edge popping up, simply lift slightly from under the board to push up in that spot and allow more room for the inset to drop into place. You shouldn't need to force the square insets or bend the edges. When you get to the diagonal holes that connect the chestnut squares, use whichever needle has more thread and use the single needle technique again to go out and back. When using only a single needle, be sure your thread lays flat and pull those stitches tight. Here you can see what I mentioned about it looking as though you skipped a stitch when using the single needle technique. As you stitch back to the starting hole, it does fill in and look correct. And definitely be careful of that thread getting caught on the corner of your board. When you are back to where you started, you should again have one needle on the top and one needle on the bottom. Stitch forward and repeat again to fill in the next diagonal connection. Again, for the single needle stitch, use the longer of your 2 threads to go out and back. You will be using this single needle technique quite often in this project, and you want to keep your thread lengths as even as possible. And remember, if your edges are not laying flat and flush with each other between the chestnut and the black, just lift up gently from underneath to create a little space for those to sit next to each other. Now continue on your stitch line using your 2-needle saddle stitch until you get around and into the last hole with thread. When you get back to the hole that has thread in it already, you can either backstitch or forward stitch onto the black to lock in those stitches. I personally prefer to complete my back stitches on the black leather rather than on the chestnut insets. After backstitching, be sure to cut and melt your threads on the backside so the top of your chessboard is clean and beautiful. Try to pre-visualize your path, keeping in mind that sometimes you will need to use the single needle technique to connect across the diagonals or to connect other stitch lines. Remember, there are no wrong choices here. It is simply a fun puzzle to reach all of the spots you'd like to go while keeping your stitch lines as neat and clean as possible. Here I'm showing you the path to add 2 chestnut inserts in one stitch line. I'll start in one corner next to a diagonal and then stitch away from the diagonal. Add any single needle stitches required to connect the diagonals with the chestnut insets and stitch all the way around back to where you started. As I said, this is a long project. I recorded this stitching over the course of 3 days, but I probably recommend stretching it out over a week or so to save your fingers. Stitching 2 insets at a time will likely use about 7 to 8 feet of thread, and that's about the maximum I'd recommend working with so your thread links don't become tangled or difficult to work with. Using these patterns, you should be able to add all of the square insets and stitching. Take your time, and remember that if you make a mistake, you can always fix it. Even I sometimes still need to cut out a few stitches and start again. I hope you had a great time stitching this project and that it brings you years of enjoyment. As always, know that if you have questions, we're here to help, so don't ever hesitate to reach out. Until next time, from our family to yours, happy making.